They say there are places in the world where the wind seems to carry memories that don't belong to our time. Places where the stone breathes, as if it still holds the warmth of the hands that shaped it thousands of years ago. But what if those hands weren't just Egyptian, not just human in the sense we imagine? And if, before pyramids shine under the desert sun, silent architectures already existed, invisible to the official history, but deeply alive in Earth's memory? Maybe you've already felt this, a subtle intuition, a kind of echo that awakens when we see ancient ruins or structures so precise that they seem to defy the very logic. It's almost as if we were in front of a mirror of the past, reflecting something which we have not yet been able to name. As if the pyramids were just the chapter visible from a much older book. A book written before Egypt, before the Nile, before of what we call civilization. Think about it. Every ancient culture describes an earlier time, a lost era, where the knowledge seemed to flow like water from a rock. The Egyptians spoke of the Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods walked the earth and taught the secrets of sacred construction. The Greeks spoke of a golden age. Hindus recorded cycles of worlds that were born and died like cosmic breaths. And the people themselves of the desert, they spoke of cities swallowed by time, built by nameless hands. But what if all this wasn't just myth? What if the pyramids were heirs, not the beginning, of an even older architectural tradition, so remote that it dissolves into the mists between history and oblivion? Perhaps the real question is not how pyramids were built, but what came before them. There are stones in Egypt that look out of place in Egypt itself. There are cuts so precise that they appear to be made by light. There are alignments so exact that they could have been drawn with instruments that would only reappear thousands of years later. And then we ask ourselves, who taught this? Where did this architecture that seems to talk to the stars come from? If you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is just the thing that you needed to hear. Because the story that is about to unfold begins much earlier than we were told, and perhaps much earlier than we can imagine. There is one detail about the pyramids that always seems to escape the common eye. They do not emerge as a starting point of civilization, but as the culmination of something that already existed before. A summit so refined, so precise, so mathematically impossible for the period in which they were officially built, that some archaeologists, behind the scenes, confess that the pyramids seem more inherited than invented. And this is where the first revelation manifests itself. Egypt does not begin with greatness. He is born mature, like someone who wakes up knowing a language they never learned. It's almost as if I was just remembering. When we look at the architecture of the first dynasties, we notice a strange contradiction. In theory, they should present the natural evolution of learning, attempts, failures, rudiments. But what we see is exactly the opposite. The constructions, the oldest ones, those closest to the chronological beginning, are the most advanced, with perfect astronomical alignments, millimetric cuts, giant blocks moved with a precision that not even modern machines can easily replicate. From there, everything declines. As the centuries passed, the techniques became simpler, the stones smaller, imperfect fittings. It's as if time doesn't reveal progress, but an oblivion, an echo of something bigger. And when you feel this inversion, this logic that folds in on itself, comes a deep, almost intimate question. How does a civilization come into being at the top of the earth? Knowledge, and then regress? The answer perhaps lies not in Egypt itself, but in memory that Egypt carried, as if he were the guardian of a previous legacy. A last guardian of secrets inherited from an even more remote era, an era whose marks survive only as fragments scattered across the earth, like seeds carried by the wind to places we still don't fully understand. Now imagine a culture so ancient that it no longer leaves behind recognizable ruins but only patterns, alignments, ways of thinking. A culture that read the sky as if it were a book, and who molded the stone as if it were clay. A culture that knew that building on Earth was to build on a living body. What if the pyramids were the final chapter of this tradition and not the first? This possibility changes everything. She rearranges our map mental, shifts the origin, broadens the horizon. She makes us realize that maybe not we are only studying Egypt, but the remains of a world older than we imagine. A world that breathed other rhythms, other laws, other mysteries. But here comes the turning point. When we start to rethink, know that the pyramids belong to a previous lineage, everything around them begins to take on a new meaning. The older temples are no longer just temples, they become portals. The camera's underground spaces are no longer just chambers, they become archives. The erosion marks that do not correspond to the desert become memories engraved in the stone itself, and the absence of detailed records about its construction, so strangely convenient, stops being a historical chance and starts to seem like a deliberate silence, as if something had been protected from common gaze. And in the end, an inevitable synthesis remains. Perhaps the pyramids are testimonies of an architecture that did not begin in Egypt, but before it. An architecture that crossed you were like a persistent whisper, like a luminous thread connecting what we were to what we still will be. An architecture that invites us to remember that not everything is what it seems old is really the beginning. And that brings us to a new question, the question that opens the next portal. What exactly came before? And why do these deep marks seem to have been left for us now to finally see? There is a moment when mysteries begin to align like stars. And that's when we realize that the pyramids do not exist in isolation. They talk to the world entire. They talk to submerged temples, to cities swallowed by the earth, to sculptures so old that they seem to have even lost their name. And that is the revelation of this block. The pyramids are part of a global map, a planetary diagram that crosses continents as if someone, long before written history, already understood the earth as a single living body. To understand this, we need to look at places that are rarely mentioned in same sentence as Egypt. Göbekli Tepe, for example, built more than 11,000 years ago, long before organized agriculture, long before any known civilization. Your carved columns carry patterns that echo Egyptian temples, and some archaeologists believe it points to constellations that were visible only in remote times. The same happens in the mysterious underwater city of Yonaguni, in Japan, where giant blocks form terraces and stairs, whose geometry resembles the megalithic architecture of the Mediterranean. And when we look at Stonehenge Tiahuanaco for Cahokia, we perceive the same pulse, the same invisible matrix organizing the stone, the sky, and the silence. Then an inevitable interpretation emerges. These are not isolated works. These are traces of an ancient science, perhaps an emotional and energetic science that sought harmony between heaven and earth. Not a symbolic harmony, but a literal one, recorded in alignments, solar, astronomical cycles, energy points, sacred proportions, and units of recurring measure. And when we start to see these repetitions, the intimate sensation arises that everything is part of something bigger, as if the planet were a stone library, where each monument is a page written not with ink, but with light. But this is where human reflection comes in strongly, because if there is this common thread, if there is a language that crosses worlds and eras, why have we lost the ability to read it? Was it time that erased it, or were we the ones who closed our eyes? Maybe we moderns, accustomed to looking down, have forgotten that our ancestors looked up and inward, with a depth that no longer we achieved. They saw the world as a mirror, as a temple, as a body. We see it as a resource. Maybe that's why we don't understand ancient architecture. It was not built to impress eyes, but to awaken souls. And then the turning point happens. When we realize that this network of monuments crosses the planet, we began to suspect that the knowledge that gave rise to it did not belong to a specific people, but to a previous cycle of humanity. A cycle that may have been interrupted by cataclysms, axis shifts, global floods, phenomena that so many cultures recorded in almost identical myths. Isn't it strange that separate peoples across oceans have spoken of the same flood, the same lost ages, the same masters who came before? It seems too coincidental to be a coincidence. And so, we arrive at the synthesis of this block. Perhaps the architecture prior to the pyramids did not been destroyed. It just sank into time like stones resting in the bottom of an ocean. The pyramids would then be lighthouses of this ancient world, landmarks left on the surface so that one day we could reconstruct the complete map. And it is at this point that the new portal appears. If pre-Egyptian architecture was global, here's the evidence we haven't seen yet, and why some seem so determined to keep them hidden. There are places in Egypt where the landscape itself seems to hold greater secrets than the words. And one of these places is the region surrounding the Sphinx. There, between Shadows and Sile. In recent times, there lies a revelation that is almost too uncomfortable to fit into the official narrative. The Sphinx is older than Egypt. Not just a little older but thousands of years older than any dynastic record. It is a truth that emerges not from speculation, but of stone, of erosion, of geology, of what time writes without ask permission. When geologists analyze the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, they notice marks wavy, curvy, smooth like rivers that no longer exist. And the science is clear. Those marks are not from wind, they are not from sand, they are not from the desert. These are rain marks, heavy, voluminous, persistent rain. But here the paradox arises. Egypt does not receive rain of this type for more than 12,000 years. In other words, the Sphinx existed at a time when the Sahara was still green, fertile, alive. A time when the stars occupied another position in which human cycles were guided by forces that we barely remember today. A time before what we call civilization. And when this conclusion appears, when we realize that the Sphinx does not belong to the line of traditional time, something inside us moves. It's as if an inner door opened, revealing that there is much more story behind the story. And in this movement, the interpretation, perhaps the Sphinx is a survivor, a monument that withstood cataclysms, climate change, and human oblivion, a lonely pillar of a world that is gone, a stone archive so old that no writing accompanied it, because writing might not even exist yet, or existed in another form, lost in the dust of cycles. But this perception creates a profound reflection. If the Sphinx is a remnant of another era, then the entire Giza Plateau may be just the visible surface of a story that rests hidden. Blocked tunnels, sealed chambers, embedded astronomical maps in the alignment of the stones. Egypt becomes less of a country and more of an organism, with layers, veins, underground memories. And we modern visitors play just your skin, unable to feel what pulses beneath. And then comes the almost inevitable turning point. If the Sphinx precedes the dynasties, if it belongs to a previous humanity, so who really carved it? There are no records. There is no names. There are no hieroglyphs. There is no celebration. Nothing. It's as if the builders had disappeared, leaving only his work and silence. A silence so great that, paradoxically, it speaks more than any text. Synthesis, therefore, appears like a breath. The Sphinx is the witness of a world forgotten, a sentinel positioned between Earth's cycles, guardian of knowledge that precedes the pyramids and perhaps even the idea of history itself. She doesn't just look at the East, looks back to a time we do not yet understand. And this brings us to the question that opens the next portal, whether the Sphinx is the shadow of a previous civilization, that other traces of that lost era are still hidden, and why do so many seem determined not to see them? There is a moment in the investigation of the ages before Egypt when the question ceases to be what was built, and it becomes what is being hidden, because behind the ancient stones there is a second enigma, not that of antiquity, but that of occultation. And that is the revelation of this block. There are old structures, chambers, and technologies that have already were found but remain inaccessible to the public, not because of impossibility technique, but by human decisions. Closed doors, access denied, silence, administrative. One of the most intriguing examples is the small passages that leave the Chamber of Queen inside the Great Pyramid. For decades it was believed that they were just symbolic conduits, until a robot, in 1993, found a small limestone door with copper parts, fitted with almost surgical precision. The robot recordings they showed not just a sealed door but a seal, a clear intention to prevent anyone could cross that. And years later, when another team got stuck discreetly that door, he found another door behind it, another barrier, another silence. This leads us to the emotional and scientific interpretation. If there is nothing to hide, why so many layers of blocking? Why are huge chambers revealed by scans of muons remain officially forbidden to be explored? Why tunnels under the Sphinx are recorded by radar, but never open to independent study? It's like if, at some point in recent history, someone had decided that certain truths were not should emerge, truths that perhaps would change not only archaeology, but spiritual understanding we have about who we were and who we are. And when we realize this, human reflection arises. How many times in our own lives do we hide parts of ourselves because revealing them would require rewriting everything? Maybe the earth also has zones of silence, places where deep memories remain kept because we were not ready to understand them. Maybe these chambers are not just physical, but symbolic, represent entire parts of the history that remains locked away, because we still don't know how to deal with its depth. But the turning point happens precisely here. Over the last few decades, excavations' independence, marginalized researchers and scientists who dared to think outside the pattern began to reveal pieces that don't fit into the official puzzle. Brands of machines where there should only be chisels. Perfect drilling in granite where simple tools wouldn't stand a chance. Blocks move in ways that challenge traditional physics. And suddenly, the silence of the official spokespeople starts to sound less as caution and more as discomfort. A discomfort with the possibility that pyramids and their temples were not just human works, or at least, they were not humanities at the technological level that is assumed. The synthesis then appears like an underground whisper. Perhaps the true mystery is not in the hidden chambers, but in the very refusal to open them. Maybe what's buried be not just stone, but memory of a time before. The pharaohs before to the stories we tell to keep reality stable, simple, linear, and deep down, this all leads us to a question that pulses like a call. Whether there are closed doors in the Great Pyramid, how many similar doors are there in the history? And what would happen if we finally decided to cross them? If something inside you is awakening, stay until the end. The answer may be here. There is a point in the investigation when ancient architecture stops being just stone and turns into energy, literally. And that is the revelation of this block. The pyramids, and the structures that came before them, seem to have been designed not just as monuments, but as devices capable of channeling, amplify, or modulate Earth's natural forces. A hypothesis that for a long time was rejected, but which today is beginning to take shape as modern technologies reveal behaviors that are impossible to ignore. When engineers and physicists analyze the Great Pyramid as a geometric structure pure, something curious emerges. Its proportions replicate natural phenomena, such as waves, frequencies, and patterns found in crystals and electromagnetic fields. The camera's internal speakers function like giant speakers, each resonating at frequencies specific. The so-called King's Chamber, entirely made of granite, a material piezoelectric, responds by measurably vibrating when stimulated with certain frequencies. And when these vibrations occur, the granite releases small electrical charges. This is not a myth. It is physics. It is observable science. And here the interpretation arises. What if these constructions were not just tombs, temples, or commemorative monuments? What if they were part of a lost technology? A technology based on harmony, resonance, the interaction between matter and energy. Not a machine in the modern sense, but an organism, an instrument, a device, spiritual, scientific, a type of architecture that connected earth to sky, stone to vibration to the human being. Perhaps our ancestors were less concerned about death and much more interested in understanding and accessing expanded states of consciousness. This leads us to a deep reflection. Why, over time, we separate science and spirituality as if they were enemies. Ancient civilizations did not separate them. For them, building a temple was no different from tuning a musical instrument or preparing a healing ritual. Everything was an extension of the same. Intelligence. A unique gesture expressing the unity between body, cosmos, and spirit. Maybe that's why today we understand ancient architecture, because we try to interpret it with divided eyes, while it was built by minds that saw everything as one thing. But the turning point comes when we realize that many of these energetic patterns appear in structures even older than the Egyptian pyramids, in megalithic temples of Malta, whose real age remains controversial, in underground chambers, in Turkey and the Caucasus, in stone circles scattered across Western Europe, on platforms cyclopean trees of Peru. It is as if there existed, before Egypt, a civilization, or a set of them, who understood the earth as a living network, a vibrating field that could be enabled through architecture. And when that awareness was lost, we also lost the key that gave meaning to these constructions. The synthesis of this block is inevitable. If these structures functioned as devices energetic, then the pyramids do not represent the beginning, but the final echo of a much older technology, a technology so integrated with the sacred that its memory becomes dissolved when we started to see the world only as matter. Maybe the pyramids are, in fact, the last attempt to preserve this knowledge before the great forgetfulness. And that leads us to the next portal, because one question rises like a beacon: whether that technology existed. Where are the direct proofs, the physical traces of that civilization that dominated energy, stone, and spirit? There is a point in the journey where we stop looking for answers in what still stands, and we begin to look for them in what has already disappeared. Because the true revelation of this block is this: there are traces of a civilization before Egypt spread across the world, but many of them have been erased, buried, or reinterpreted to fit within a narrative that does not support the unknown. Not because they are missing evidence, but because it doesn't fit with what we choose to believe about ourselves. Same. The revelation begins with a simple detail. There are structures so ancient that they defy even human chronology itself. The megalithic platform of Baalbek, for example, where blocks of more than 1,000 tons were moved as if they were mere pieces of a game. Or the precise cuts from the Temple of Osirian at Abydos that appear much older than their official facade suggests, so old that some researchers believe they were built when Egypt wasn't even Egypt yet. And when we look at these traces with attention, we realize that they carry the same energetic signature, the same pattern architectural, the same technical daring that we found in Giza. Hence the interpretation emerges. Perhaps these constructions are not isolated creations but fragments of the same puzzle, remains of a mother civilization that knew deeply mathematics, astronomy, resonance, precision engineering, and, above all, everything: the spiritual relationship between humanity and cosmos. A civilization that did not let only temples, he left instruments. He didn't just leave stone, he left language. A language that today we try to understand with modern techniques, but which can only be reveals itself completely when we approach it with sensitivity, awareness, and humility. And then human reflection arises. Why does this idea bother us so much? Maybe because admitting a civilization prior to ours, older and possibly more advanced, requires renounce the illusion that we are the culmination of history. It requires recognizing that time is cyclical, not linear, that humanity remembers and forgets, expands and contracts, flourishes, and then it disappears, like waves that touch the sand and retreat into the sea. Maybe the discomfort comes from the fact that in accepting a previous world, we must also accept that our world may not be the last. But the turning point comes when we realize that signs of this lost civilization are not they appear only in stone, they appear in myths. Atlantis described by Plato, a Lemuria echoed in Asian traditions, the Egyptian Zep-Tepi, the Hindu Golden Age, the previous worlds mentioned by Andean peoples and North American natives. None of these accounts are identical, and yet they all carry the same structure: an ancient, powerful, harmonious civilization, destroyed by cataclysms, guarding its secrets in symbolic knowledge and sacred places. When so many people, separated across oceans and millennia, tell the same story, this stops being a coincidence and becomes shared memory. The synthesis then imposes itself like a soft light. Perhaps what we call civilization lost is not a myth, but a memory of the planet, a memory that blew secrets for people all over the world, who left clues in impossible stones, who whispered symbols in the constellations, and that somehow transmitted to Egypt the last fragment of his wisdom. The pyramids would thus be the final echo, and not the beginning, of a much older cycle. And that leads us to the final portal of this journey, to the question that prepares the next block and closes all the previous ones in a perfect circle. If this ancient civilization existed, it is not just in the past when it left something for us, but what exactly, and why now, at this moment in humanity, do we finally start to remember? We have reached the point where the journey stops being just archaeological and becomes spiritual. Because when we try to understand what came before the pyramids, what existed before Egypt, which vibrated before history, we realize something profound. No, we're just looking for a lost civilization. We're looking for ourselves, same. Previous architecture is not just ancient stone. It's a mirror that invites us to remember who we were before we forget who we are. The final revelation is simple, and at the same time, immense. These structures were not built just to mark a territory on Earth. They were erected to mark a territory on Earth, human consciousness. They were maps, bridges, portals, invitations, so that humanity does not limited to the visible, but touch the invisible. And when we walk among the stones, silent views of the pyramids or megalithic ruins scattered throughout the planet, we feel that something inside us awakens, something that has no name, but has direction, something that doesn't have form, but it has memory, as if, somewhere in our spirit, there, still existed a key to deciphering what those ancient builders wanted to remind us of. This brings us to the deepest emotional interpretation of all. Perhaps this architecture previously has not really disappeared. Maybe it's alive inside us, like a dormant knowledge, waiting for the right moment to blossom again. No, it is a coincidence that, all over the world, people are awakening an intuitive interest by ancient mysteries, by symbols, by connections with the cosmos. It's not fashion. It's not chance. It's memory. A memory that was not lost, just silent, and now it starts emerge, like a star that reappears after passing through a cloud. And then the inevitable reflection arises. Why now? Why do these questions start to echo so strongly in our generation? Maybe because we're living the same moment that those ancient people lived before the Great Oblivion, a point of transition, a point at which humanity needs to decide whether to remain disconnected from your own spirit or remember that science and soul, reason and mystery, earth and sky, they were always one thing. Maybe we are the generation that finally has tools, spiritual, emotional, and technological, to look to the past without fear and to the future without arrogance. The turning point happens when we understand that the previous civilization did not want we admired not only its engineering, but its intention. They built with purpose, with conscience, with reverence for life. Perhaps the true legacy is not in perfection of the blocks, but in the way they were placed, like someone inscribing a prayer on earth itself. Not a prayer to a distant God, but a prayer to the humanity itself, so that one day it would awaken again. And so we arrive at the final synthesis. The past is not behind us. It's within us. The pyramids, the Sphinx, forgotten temples, megaliths scattered throughout the world. They all form a single message, a silent but clear message for those who allow yourself to feel. You didn't. Start now. You are remembering. And when we look at this legacy with an open heart, we realize that architecture ancient is not just a work, it is a calling. And before closing, I leave a soft seed. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. Your soul may be just starting to remember the way. And now a question that echoes beyond the mind and rests in the silence. What if what we call the past is just the future trying to be remembered?